Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
Good to be here.
I am really looking forward to this. Our sources today, they seem to start with a very specific question, about protecting the Turkish language. But they pivot, and they do it almost immediately, into something much, much bigger.
They really do.
We're talking about the relationship between your mother tongue, your anadil, and the actual structure of your mind.
It's a perfect example of using a specific case to get at a universal truth, because really it doesn't matter if we're talking about Turkish or English or Mandarin. The basic mechanics are the same.
Right.
The central claim here, and it's a bold one, is that your first language is basically the operating system for your intellect. And if that system gets corrupted, well, your whole ability to think gets compromised.
It is a huge assertion. So I think our job today is to really unpack that. We need to look at the science, the arguments. What actually happens when a language starts to, as the source puts it, disintegrate?
And how that affects the person who's supposed to be the culture taşıyıcısı.
A culture carrier.
Exactly. And let's be clear from the get-go. This isn't about nostalgia. This is about cognitive architecture. It's about how the brain literally builds itself.
Okay, so let's start right there. The cognitive foundation. The source makes a fascinating point that a baby arrives without a self, without the concept of Benlik.
It's a blank slate, cognitively speaking. And the real foundational work, the sprint, happens in that first year. We're talking mostly within the first 8 months.
Through interaction, through hearing sounds.
Through immersion. That's how the child isn't just learning words, but installing the entire cognitive hard drive.
This sounds a lot like the innate language apparatus theory, the one we often associate with Noam Chomsky, that we're just wired for this.
Oh, that predisposition is definitely there. But here's the kicker. The specific language you're exposed to does way more than just label things. It actually dictates your fundamental perception of the world, your algı.
You mean through the grammar itself, the rules?
Yes, think about word order. In a language like Turkish, it's subject, object, verb. You have to wait until the very end of the sentence to get the action.
Whereas in English, subject, verb, object, you get the action right away. You establish who's doing what immediately.
Precisely. And that small difference completely changes how you process causality, how you process intention. Your brain is running a different set of protocols.
So if the language provides the rules for reality, then the conclusion from the source, language is the mind. That's not a metaphor.
It's a structural consequence. It's almost an equation.
Wow. Okay, so if I'm following this, if language is the architecture, then letting your language get sloppy or degraded means you're literally weakening your mind's ability to think.
That's the core argument, and you see little indicators of this weakness all the time. The sources point to things like overusing foreign loanwords, or even, interestingly, swearing.
Swearing? How does that fit in?
It's a cognitive shortcut. When your linguistic toolkit isn't sharp enough to express a nuanced frustration or a complex idea, you reach for a blunt instrument. It's a sign that your mental capacity for articulation is hitting a wall.
But hold on, isn't this a bit alarmist? I mean, languages change. Latin didn't just decay, it evolved into French, Spanish, Italian.
That's a fantastic point, and it's a crucial distinction. What happened with Latin was fragmentation. New, robust systems grew out of it.
Right.
The problem described in the sources isn't that, it's thinning. It's a loss of conceptual depth within the existing language.
A loss of the historical corpus.
Yes. A perfect analogy is our own DNA. Something like 80% of our DNA is non-coding. It's our evolutionary history. And we pass all of it on. A language has to do the same thing with its vast vocabulary, its own evolutionary data. If you start stripping that away, you limit what the mind can do.
Which brings us to this idea of the Debik Problem, the problem of superficiality.
The 300-word cage.
We get by day to day with maybe a few hundred words, but that vocabulary restricts any kind of deeper thought. You can't grasp philosophy, you can't even concentrate deeply.
Because your ability to process reality depends entirely on the resolution of your dictionary. It's like trying to watch a 4K movie on an old tube television.
Right.
Look at the word stress. It's everywhere, but it's so broad it's almost meaningless.
And the source contrasts this one word with all the historical Turkish alternatives.
Yeah.
Gam, Keter, Kasavet, Huzun, melancholy.
Exactly. Each one of those is a different tool. Kasavet isn't just stress, it's a specific, suffocating anxiety about the future. If you only have the word stress, you can't even properly diagnose your own internal state.
So you lower your diagnostic resolution.
Yeah, and your solution resolution. You can't solve a problem you can't accurately name.
So if I can only say I'm stressed, I've already limited my pathways to feeling better. I've lost the necessary precision.
Absolutely. This is why we have to be careful about borrowing words. It's not that all borrowing is bad. A word like feriset. It has Arabic roots but became incredibly rich in Turkish, meaning something like wise discernment, that fills a conceptual gap.
But something like meeting set etmek in modern Turkish.
It's just lazy. It replaces a perfectly good native word and thins out the language. It adds nothing.
So if the problem is this conceptual thinness, what's the solution? The sources propose something that's surprisingly direct. Strengthening your mind through etymology.
It's pure neurology. Your brain is a network. Concepts aren't stored as single points. They're stored as massive meaning clouds, all interconnected with emotions, history, other concepts.
So the strength of your mind is basically how dense and interconnected those clouds are.
That's it, which is why the advice is so simple but so powerful. Look up the etymology, the koken, the root of one normal word every day.
Just one a day.
It's like intellectual weightlifting. You are deliberately building deeper, richer connections in your own mind. You're fighting superficiality directly.
The source even tells a story about how doing this in his native Turkish gave him a huge advantage when he later learned English.
Of course it did. Because he wasn't building from scratch. He was mapping a new language onto a deeply sophisticated, high-resolution cognitive framework that was already there. Depth in one language gives you flexibility in all others.
And this personal responsibility connects directly to that idea of being a culture carrier. You have a job to pass on the full conceptual power of the language.
You have to reproduce the kadim, the ancient wisdom, in a modern context. If you don't, the world available to the next generation just gets smaller.
This makes me think about the systemic problems mentioned. The sources are pretty critical of official institutions, but they reserve their strongest critique for the education system.
Oh, yes. Specifically, the practice of teaching subjects like medicine or engineering in a foreign language.
Right, at Turkish universities, for example.
The source calls it a betrayal, a great ignorance. And I think that's structurally correct. It's a terrible way to teach the foreign language, for one, but far worse.
You create professionals with a shallow foundation.
Exactly. The doctor who learned medicine in English has the terminology, but the core concepts are sitting on a layer of translation. They're not embedded in the bedrock of their mother tongue. They spend brain power translating instead of innovating.
So you get superficial competence.
You do. The only effective way is to master the concepts in your native language first. Build the solid foundation, then add the international terminology on top. Doing it the other way around is just, it's dangerously backward.
So let's zoom out. Why does this matter globally? The sources cite Neuroscience from after 2000 that confirms speakers of, say, Chinese, Arabic, and English literally use different neural networks.
They see the world differently, and this is not about one language being superior. That's a biological misunderstanding. It's about variety. Diversity is strength.
So if everyone is forced into a single, simplified, global English,
the collective human mind becomes homogeneous. It becomes easier to manipulate. It gets, for lack of a better term, dumbed down. Our species' strength is in its different ways of thinking.
So when you think about it, for you, listening to this, preserving language isn't just some cultural project. It is, in a very real sense, intellectual self-defense.
And the sources remind us, even ancient religious texts say things like, I created you as nations so that you may know one another. Diversity is presented as a prerequisite for strength.
Yet we're reportedly losing a language every 2 days.
A profound crisis for human knowledge.
Which brings up a really challenging final thought. As these languages vanish, we're also seeing the rise of incredibly powerful AI translation. Could these systems preserve the cognitive diversity, the unique neural pathways of these dying languages, even if no one speaks them anymore?
Can technology become the carrier of our conceptual legacy?
That's a huge question.
It forces us to keep digging, to stay curious about the koken, the root of things, because that engagement, that's a mind working at its absolute peak.
A compelling place to leave it. This is the fascinating exploration of how the words we use truly build the world we experience. Thank you for joining us.
Until next time.